4th, 2015 Washougal City Council Workshop Meeting. Rose, could you call the roll, please?
Yes. Councilmember Boger?
Here.
Councilmember Greenlee?
Here.
Councilmember Lindsay?
Here.
Councilmember Wagner?
Here.
Councilmember McDaniel?
Here.
Councilmember Shoemaker?
Here.
Councilmember Freeman?
Councilmember Freeman did indicate that she'd be just a few minutes late this evening for this meeting. Are there any members of the public that would like to address council before we get started this evening? I know we've got a lot of information to get through in regards to the presentation by Parsons Brinkerhoff, but if there are folks that can't wait until the end of the meeting, we would certainly entertain comments at this point. Okay, we'll wait until the end. Trevor, you've got a couple of items on this evening. Good evening.
Thank you, Mayor Gard, Council. The first on the agenda for Public Works is a proposed scope of work or scope of services from FCS Group from Redmond, Washington. As you know, they've been assisting us ongoing with our water and sewer rate analysis. At this point, we're looking to update our stormwater utility rates as well as our capital improvement plan and the revenue associated with that. The utility was created in 2007. We did an update in 2010, so that specific study is sunsetting at the end of this year. So what the bookends for the proposed study would be 2016 through 2020. And that would also take into consideration our reporting requirements as far as our NPDES Phase 2 permit as well to be in compliance with Department of Ecology. You also see in the breakdown there's quite a bit identified within the meetings and presentations. If we can collapse that at all as far as keeping the anticipated cost down, we'll do so. So the meetings and presentations is a max for FCS to travel to Washougal. And the next steps on this would be consent for your consideration at the first meeting in September 14th. Any questions on the proposed scope from FCS Group in regards to our stormwater utility?
Sounds like you're good.
Okay. Okay, for the next agenda item, I'd like to turn it over to Administrator Scott, do a brief introduction for Mr. Hemmer with Parsons Brinkerhoff. Chris has worked with us several times, most recently in 2011 in partnership with the Port of Camas-Washougal to run some alternatives, specifically in regards to SR14. We've re-engaged with Chris and have a presentation this evening in regards to the 27th Street Bridge crossing.
Thank you, Trevor. Mayor and Council, Trevor introduced Chris. He and I are going to share the presentation. I'm going to go over some background and context. I know that at least 4 of the council members weren't here when the first plan, transportation plan, was adopted in 2005 and then updated recently, and then also for the last time that PB did some analysis for us, and so you didn't have the benefit of sitting live through those presentations or being part of the deliberative process that the councils at the time undertook. So some of this is historical review and background and context is specifically intended to try to inform and have everybody sharing as much as possible the same context, same background, and same information as we move forward. So to do that, our agenda for this presentation is to go through that background, talk a little bit about the history of this particular project, this particular crossing, turn to what happened in 2011, what our goals were and what the process was that we undertook at that time, some of the alternatives that fell out of that analysis, then focus in more detail on the 27th Street project itself, look at 32nd, in both of those with some level of detail, similar level of detail if you would. At your request, there's been some concept exploration at 39th and at Sunset View as alternatives. However, the scope of services that we had didn't allow for the level of alternative analysis that we were able to do on project that we're already working on, including both 27th and 32nd. Then we'll have some summarizing comments and an opportunity for questions or council discussion. At a very high level background, I think we all know that we have a State Growth Management Act. It requires that we develop a comprehensive land use plan, and that's about 20 years old or so, that legislation. And in addition to your comprehensive land use plan, we are required to have accompanying capital facilities plans, and those have to specifically serve the growth that's identified in the land use plan. So the way that works is the state and the county provide targets for us for population and jobs, and then we have to develop a plan that will accommodate those. We make a number of assumptions about residential densities, and we make assumptions about how many jobs per acre that we'll see in our community. And at the time when the city developed this, all of the city is considered in that. All of the vacant lands, underdeveloped lands, and then there's a determination as to whether or not those targets have been achieved in the existing footprint of the city. And at the time, the determination was no, that had not been achieved, and so expansion into the urban growth areas that we now know as Woodburn and Norway, northwest and northeast urban growth areas, was identified with our first comprehensive plan. And really the reason for heading that way is because we're constrained by our existing land uses, development that's already occurred, the scenic area, as we know, to the east, the river to the south, and our neighbors and friends in Camas to the west. So if a decision is made that we need additional urban development territory, it has to go north if we cannot accommodate it inside our existing city footprint. And one of those areas, as you know, is the Mountain Norway area, and our zoning in that area, even though it's still in the county, identifies some commercial, multifamily, and employment center zoning. So that's part of the background. So as I mentioned, our transportation infrastructure, our plans, our capital facilities plans for transportation have to demonstrate that we're serving these areas. We could not, back in the day, the city could not have expanded and added these urban growth areas without transportation capital facilities plans that demonstrated how it would be served. Water, sewer, transportation, to name just a few of those. However, the need to get up the 32nd Stiles 34th corridor to this urban growth area is not the only relevant background and context regarding the 27th Street project. In addition to that, there's been a desire from our partner and friends at the Port of Camas-Washougal to enhance their access off of the state route in the vicinity of 27th and 32nd. And that's been something that, and I'm sure you've heard from them before, and you heard from them in 2011. Enhanced access to them is really important. And we've had plans to provide access to vacant lands that are north of SR 14 between River Road and 27th, and really all the way to 32nd. And exactly how that should happen and how that access should be achieved and accomplished off of the state route has been a topic of conversation for a number of years, and there are a number of different ideas that have been out there about how that can be accomplished, and there's been some iterations around that. You may remember roundabouts, and then we'll get into that a little bit further as we move forward. And then lastly, but not leastly, in the context for this project is a need to provide a second crossing over the BNSF line, a grade separated crossing. We only have the one grade separated crossing, and so as we look at our emergency management planning, traffic management, and then all the things that I just mentioned, all of that stirs together to point to the need for a project and for a crossing. And it's all of that information that led to the development of a multifaceted transportation project, and it was envisioned to meet all of those goals. Everything that I just mentioned. Improvements to the state route, and we'll get into that a little bit about what those were. Those are not funded. as you know. Improvements to local streets within the port. Those are not funded as of yet. A second crossing over the BNSF line at 27th, partially funded, as you know, out of this legislative session through the gas tax. Improvements to Evergreen and 32nd, that intersection, that's funded, that project is underway. And then improvements to 32nd, Stiles, and the 34th corridor up to this urban growth area, that is unfunded. That entire package of improvements is what we have been advocating for your staff since before my time, legislatively advocating for this entire package of improvements. There have been some iterations, but that's what we've been working on, and it's just in this past session where we got some traction and got some funding. Unfortunately, it's not for the whole package. It's for one piece of it. Now, I should say we did get the funding for the intersection. That project's less than $2 million, I believe, and for reasons you can imagine, that one got funded a little more readily. So as we turn to 27th and look at the history of that, the idea of a crossing of the railroad at 27th, we found in our records, dates back at least 30 years, and we'll show you some information about that. As I mentioned, it was included as a high priority project in Washougal's first Transportation Capital Facilities Plan. That was in 2005. And then since that time, it's been included in all the subsequent iterations and subsets of that plan that have been adopted by the council, including our transportation system plan and the dates that you see there. Notably, it is included in the Regional Transportation Council's Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That makes it a project of regional significance and makes it eligible for various funding. And then before I leave this slide, to turn it over to Chris, I will mention that it's included in a 2013 state rail plan as one of few improvements on the main line along the river. I don't really have any details for that. Chris was just going to comment briefly on that.
I looked into the state rail plan to get a sense of what the projected rail traffic was going to be on the line as it went through 32nd, mainly to make sure that I had the most up-to-date information given some of the changes in unit train planning and so forth, and the train traffic volume increases. In doing so, I also reviewed the projects included statewide for rail improvements that range from safety enhancements to actual track improvements to improve capacity and so forth. For the BNSF main line between Vancouver, all the way out to Pasco, basically, the 27th Street overcrossing was one of the few projects identified on that line for improvement as a safety improvement for the line, as well as local access for pedestrian and bicycles enhancement. And so that's where I discovered that. The key component of where that comes from is they actually did a survey of all of the regional transportation plans from the MPOs across the state. And so when they reviewed RTC's plan, they saw the 27th crossing adopted in that plan and then incorporated into the statewide state rail plan.
Thank you, Chris.
Quick question on one of the bullets there. In all the subsequent iterations of this plan, like you said, and since it has been a #1 priority of the city, why wasn't the price of the bridge input in those subsequent iterations? Why was it left, and this was touched upon a little bit in the 27th workshop, and Connie Jo questioned it a little bit. Why wasn't that price of $8 million updated, that initial $8 million?
It was, but it was updated after the project got traction a couple of sessions ago, maybe 3 sessions ago, and that number unfortunately stuck in spite of our advocacy that the number had been updated with a subsequent iteration, and that was an unfortunate timing thing that happened.
So in some of our documents, we updated the monetary cost of the project, but it didn't get into the states.
Well, we shared the information, but it didn't manifest itself in an appropriation of the full price of the project. It stayed at the number from a prior iteration of the transportation plan.
So there wasn't an intent in the legislature, to the extent you can discern one, to basically fund half of the project?
No, I don't believe so. I think the chair of the Transportation Committee and the senior staff person who have been very, very supportive, and we're very grateful for their support. Back at the time, we had documents in front of them that had a number from the currently adopted transportation plan, zeroed in on that. I remember the meeting where they did that, and that number got in their working documents, I believe is what happened at the Transportation Committee. And then, as you can imagine, it was really a multi-session project for the Senate Transportation Committee as they were getting out in front of this project. It was a multi-session project to do the overall package, and that project with that number was on lists. We did, in our advocacy, share information about the bigger number. But by the time that was happening, the momentum and where it was at was such that they didn't make a change to that number in order to make that work in the overall package. So it was an unfortunate timing sort of a situation. I wish it was different. But that's what happened, and that's why the funding is what the funding is. I don't believe that there was ever a deliberate decision on behalf of the staff or the leadership in that committee to fund half of the project. But they zeroed in on a number that we shared with them early in the process, which was an accurate number at the time. And then it changed as the costs increased and time went by. So that got away from us a little bit, yet here we are. That's the appropriation that we have.
Is there a chance of getting it, in the supplemental, getting at least some of it recovered?
Well, I would like to think so. I'd like to hope so. And I certainly think that we're going to continue our advocacy. I understand that and I don't really know the details, and I don't want to raise expectations at all, but I understand that there may be some unallocated or unspecifically appropriated funding available in the package. And
I've heard that too.
I'm not sure what the mechanism is for that, whether that's going to be an agency distribution based on some sort of programmatic criteria. That's one possibility. Certainly in a supplemental process in one or in the next session, maybe things will change with some other projects and there'll be some opportunities. I think our state senator and our state representatives could help us with that. I'm sure they understand the need for it. Senator Rivers was well aware of that, but what we have is what was able to manifest out of that process. So in the earlier part of last decade, well, before I get to that, we don't have a lot of information about this other than this image. And Chris found this in their files as they were looking at this project. This is a 1983 concept document from WSDOT. We had not seen this before, but back at that time they were looking at a fairly significant sort of interchange scenario. I don't even know what that's called. It's sort of like clover leaves, but not clover leaves, at 27th. And you can see that the thinking was a crossing at 27th. Exactly the alignment looked like it tried to run along that railroad spur a little bit before it headed north. And you can see that there was a minor realignment of Main Street to accommodate that project and to allow that crossing. So keep that visual in mind as we look further and we see some of the more updated documents that we've been using, but I thought it was interesting that Chris was able to find this and just to show that there's been thinking about this project for quite some time. How this manifested itself in our planning documents dates back to the very first, as far as as we all are aware, in 2005, our very first Transportation Capital Facilities Plan, our first formal one, was adopted. This may look familiar to you because it has similar graphic presentation to our current plan. You can see a dotted line there between the letters B and X. That is a new roadway. That's the crossing. Interestingly, you can see some roundabouts on East Street, and those that have been on council for a while will remember some of the iterations around not doing that or not doing that. Obviously, we didn't do that in that project. At this time, just some narrative on this, we've communicated recently, just to refresh all of our memories, because the team that you have here wasn't part of the team in 2003 and 4 when this was being developed. And we weren't part of the team when this plan was adopted in 2005. We talked to the Public Works staff who were here at the time. They're still here regionally. Asked them about, why was it 27th? Why wasn't it 32nd, for example, which is one of the crossings that's been noted. And basically the indication was that they did some review of the costs and impacts of doing a 32nd crossing, and they ruled it out, and it didn't come to the decision-making table of the council that 27th was presented. I think the level of analysis that you'll hear tonight was probably more than that was, and what we did in 11 even, was more than was done in 2003 and 2004. But I think it's safe to say, kind of in a general way, that when the city granted a land use entitlement to the shopping center at the northeast there of 32nd and Evergreen, Safeway Shopping Center, that land use entitlement was granted in the late 90s, about 1988. There was also a development agreement that was approved at the time. It only vested some things. It wasn't a significant development agreement. It vested trips.
Is it 1988 or 1998?
98, 99 in that time frame. When that decision was made by the city to approve that land use entitlement for the project and enter into that DA, in my mind, and we've chatted about this here as a team, that's, to me, that was kind of when the decision was made about where this crossing was going to take place between those two streets. Whether or not that was really part of any deliberative process at the time, the implications of that project are such, and you'll see later in what we've talked about before, the implications, the issues, and the costs that arise, not exclusively, but in part because of that shopping center being there, are why the 27th alternative has been the preferred alternative since this time in about 10 years ago.
How hard would it be to get the minutes and record of the meeting with the council and or planning commission or hearing examiner? I don't know if we were on a hearing examiner system yet at that point.
From the late 90s? We have those. I mean, I don't think
I'd be curious to see if it was
even discussed.
right.
Yeah, we can try to take a peek and see what we have. So that brings us to the work that PB did for us and for the port in 2011. It was primarily an SR-14 study, and the first bullet here sets the stage for why we did this, and those that were on the council at the time will remember this. But the council at the time directed staff through its action to basically remove highway roundabouts from the preferred solution on the state route. At the time of the development of the 2005 plan and the years just after that, there had been a preferred alternative that the city had been advocating that had a couple of roundabouts on the state route at 32nd and at River. There were a couple different iterations of that. I've seen documents that showed 3 roundabouts, one a little bit west of 27th. So the notion of roundabouts and access to south and north of the state route in this part of the community was really what was kind of on the table. However, the council asked us in 2011 to no longer advocate for that and wanted to understand what the alternatives would be. Those that are on the council remember that we wanted to move expeditiously on this so that we stayed on funding lists and could continue to participate in the RTC process. So the port partnered with us financially. So the city and the port paid for the consulting services of PB to come in and do some work for us. And as you can imagine, the primary focus was out at the state route because we had taken roundabouts out and we needed to do something else. Lots of coordination with WSDOT. It's an interesting notion here. We don't plan per se the state route. It's not our facility. However, we're a significant partner in that conversation, and so we were taking the initiative on this, but obviously we have to coordinate significantly with the State Department of Transportation. It's their facility. So a number of things were done, examined future traffic conditions, looking at several different alternatives, looked at environmental impacts, and in a moment here I'll turn it over to Chris, and he's going to take over for the rest of the presentation. At the time that this study was done, although the focus was on the state route, there was some attention paid to 27th, and there was more than a dotted line. There was a little bit of work that was done. It was sort of coincident as we were beginning to get into the next iterations of our transportation facilities plans at the feasibility of that and what the implications were, strengths and weaknesses of doing that. And there was some analysis at 32nd about what the scope of that project would have to be, what it might mean at a macro conceptual level in terms of costs and impacts. That information was shared with the council at the time. We're not going to repeat all of that information, but at that time, staff was presenting, as our consultant was, that the 27th option was less expensive, less impactful, and therefore the preferred alternative. And so with that, then we moved, and Chris is going to talk about that study a little bit more.
Can I ask one quick question on one of your bullets on the previous slide? Do you recall why the roundabouts were removed as an unviable option? You said council. Did they have any specific reason, and was there any engineering input from the city or the state in regards to that removal and whether that was a viable option or not? Or was it just a couple people on council decided they didn't want roundabouts?
You know, I don't remember every detail of that. I might defer to your colleagues on the council that were here at the time, but we did not do at that point, in the moment of those conversations, we didn't engage engineering analysis beyond what had already been done in terms of the advocacy and the viability of roundabouts on the state route at that time. That had been done earlier, 5-6 years earlier. We didn't undertake additional analysis. I think that majority of the council at the time, based on feedback maybe that they'd received from constituents, their own sense of it and their own perceptions, felt that roundabouts on the state route would not be the preferred solution out there. And that was really in the wake of, and now this is getting at a time where I was just coming onto the city. These decisions were made just before I got here. There were some roundabouts on the East Street project, I think at River, and maybe even another one. Those were value engineered out because of some cost concerns.
One at River Road, yeah.
Yeah, the one at River Road. So if you take that collectively, some of the planning and emphasis that had been placed on those shifted, and we went a different direction, and this analysis was the result of that. And I think it was a helpful analysis because it showed us what other alternatives would be, what their costs would be potentially, as well as afforded another opportunity to look a little more closely at that time at 11, at 27th, and at 32nd. So it wasn't an engineering rule out, if you would. Chris, when he gets through some of his presentation, he'll share with you a little bit about what we heard from WSDOT about highway roundabouts in 2011, which is informative to that conversation as well. So again, just in conclusion, in 2011, there was some conceptual costing and impact analysis that was done at 32nd as well as at 27th. And because of the cost differential and the impact differential, the team at the time which is basically this team continued to suggest that the decision makers in '05 had been appropriate in identifying the 27th crossing as the preferred alternative. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris. And
So,
Okay.
before we go further, the other two streets weren't considered then, in this far back.
so we did hear recently, thank you for asking that because I didn't mention this, we did hear that they took a quick look at 39th. Is that the one, Rob?
Yeah, and it was it was eliminated due to the some new subdivisions to the north is the information that PB, Chris's predecessor, passed on to me. So
Right.
it didn't actually make it beyond that point.
And it never went further east at all.
Not at that
No.
time. We didn't have any right-of-way at 39th, new subdivisions going to the north, impacts, and that did not enter into the decision-making context in 2005.
Okay. So what I wanted to do was to touch on a little bit more on what we did in 2011, try to ground some of the, what may feed into a 27th or 32nd Street grade separation. Thinking through, I don't think I have the roundabout thing in my subsequent slides, so to respond to the one question, when we did sit down with WSDOT in the summer of 2011, I did bring up, because I managed to find my meeting notes from that time, the idea of roundabouts. Should that even factor in as an alternative in our analysis? And recognizing that the council at the time was not supportive of it, but from an engineering and planning perspective, we should kind of put everything on the table. WSDOT staff was not supportive of highway roundabouts at either River Road or 32nd when we did that work back in 2011. And so that kind of supported the council's direction to eliminate them from consideration. So what we did do is then start to look at, well, what kind of improvements can we do to SR 14? And we started out by defining a problem statement that would help us direct our work. The key points here are highlighted in bold on my slide. We are looking to improve freight mobility and safety, improve access for trucks and automobiles, notably to the port of Camas-Washougal, as well as, we said the city, but when we were really talking about the areas for greatest economic development and the commercial centers. To be supportive of planned economic development projects and to minimize conflicts with the expanding BNSF rail operations. And at the time, that was very much a concern. Projected coal trains, which aren't looking like they're going to happen, but at the time they are talking about rail traffic on the order of 4 trains per hour, which would have been a substantial amount of time, maybe 30 to 35% of the time occupying the grade crossing at 32nd with the gates down. So going into our study, we had several assumptions. Some of that started with the adopted capital facilities plan. So 27th Street was accepted as one of our baseline conditions, as something that was likely to happen, as well as SR 14 not being widened. So we took that into consideration in terms of our right-of-way footprint and so forth. When we looked at 27th, though, we didn't preclude other ideas. So our analysis on SR 14 wasn't dependent upon the 27th grade separation being in place. In fact, we kind of worked independent of that. And the results of our analysis actually ended up supporting, or our recommendations from the analysis ended up supporting a 27th Street grade separation, but it wasn't driven by the fact that it was already part of the capital facilities plan. So kind of a summary of what we heard from WSDOT. I guess I did have the bullet here about not supportive of the highway roundabout solution. They also brought up several points about 32nd Street. First, that if 32nd Street, when the traffic becomes heavy enough and it demonstrates a safety concern, their most likely first action would be to remove the left turn lanes off of the highway, creating a right in, right out type operation, similar to the outbound routing that is present on the at 32nd today, where you can only make a right turn onto the highway. And I've got some exhibits that will show that and highlight that in just a few slides. They also noted that an interchange at either 27th or 32nd violates their 1 mile interchange spacing, provided an interchange was provided at River Road, which was considered the higher of the priorities at the time. So we started with, well, we got to do something at River Road, and then what can be done with the port access at 27th and 32nd. It was through collaborative workshops with WSDOT that we identified that an interchange at River Road could be coupled to ramps, or more like frontage road, but we can look at it as ramps, to 27th, and by coupling it all together and not actually creating the highway access point at 27th, it wouldn't be in violation of their interchange spacing standards and be permittable. And finally, that we couldn't, while not desirable from a policy standpoint, we couldn't necessarily rule out that an interchange at 32nd wouldn't be something that you could seek a variance on. It's almost a mile between River Road and 32nd. Provided some other analysis were done. Some of the other aspects of the analysis started to move us away from that, and I'll try to elaborate on that as we go along.
I have a quick question for you.
Mhm.
Now, WSDOT said that there will not be 4 lanes, 4-lane improvements east of Washougal River Road. What was their reasoning for that?
Not enough traffic to support widening to 4 lanes. That at the time, and then we're looking out to 2030 traffic volumes at the time of the analysis, and that's what we're still using today to make sure we maintain apples to apples from the previous work. There was just not enough traffic demand to warrant going to 4 lanes.
You're going to go into more detail on this part about 27th being coupled to an interchange at Washougal River Road?
Yes.
Good, because I'm not really, I can't picture that.
Yeah, well, the
Of course, that's
good
white.
news is
Huh.
the next picture is the picture of it.
Oh, good.
So I'll try to explain this a little bit, and I may jump out of my seat because the point. In fact, why don't I do that for a second, so I might help explain it a little bit more. I think I'm tall enough. So this is what our alternative 8 was at the time. This was our big build concept. And if we got everything that we might want in terms of port access and interchanges and so forth, this is what we recommended. It was kind of the Parsons-Brinckerhoff recommendation back to city staff and ultimately council at the time. This included an interchange at Washougal River Road. And then what would happen is there would be access to SR14 for River Road traffic to get on and off, similar to any other interchange. But the ramp would also branch off into a one-way frontage road, although we could make it, you could argue to make it 2-way as well. That would drop down to 27th. This takes advantage of the existing bridge at 27th to basically be part of the interchange. And could be done with a very minor additional cost to the River Road interchange work. We were thinking maybe an extra 10% over the top of a River Road interchange alone would actually build out to 27. Pretty straightforward street construction at that point. The other thing I might note while we are on here is we are showing some local improvements for the port area, the 27th crossing as one of them, which with this recommended alternative gains a little bit more strength for being where it is, because it becomes a connection point on where the interchange would connect. And we are also looking at a Ford Street connection to shorten some of the circuitous route around the port, basically, that you have to go through today, actually, for access to eastbound SR 14. With regards to this connection, this is something that when WSDOT starts to look at closing off the left turns on SR 14, that might be the trigger mechanism that gets that Ford Street project moving up to the front burner a bit. So, yeah,
Would this plan close access to 14 at 32nd?
No, you can't actually see it here because it's kind of small and so forth, but we would maintain a right-in, right-out at 32nd. So you wouldn't have the left turns, but it would still maintain that, so you could still get off at 32nd if you're coming westbound on 14, get on at 32nd westbound. And in fact, we're relying on that for the eastbound traffic, coming down 27th, using Ford Street ideally to cut across and then get on the highway, or in this direction, moving back. And so the other alternative we suggested advancing, because it showed a similar characteristics in terms of overall benefits to reducing traffic delay and traffic operations, wasn't quite as strong for the port access, and why it wasn't really our primary alternative. But look just at an interchange at Washougal River Road, but then focused on just providing the local street improvements at the 27th, 32nd.
Do you have rough cost estimates for alternatives 8 and 6?
Yes. We were, I may have them later, but 6 is about $38 million. And 8 was 43, I believe. And that's, I believe that was everything. I think it excluded this crossing. It was for the highway improvements. We're looking, I think 27th was what you have now. Looking at about $17 million is in line with what we were thinking back then. And I honestly can't remember what Ford Street was.
About a little over $3 million, I recall.
I think most of it is right away, probably. So let's move on to the next one. So this is kind of our routing. This is our inbound circulation, and I'm showing two versions of this. One based on the existing conditions as it sits on the street today, and one if WSDOT did happen to close the left turns at 32nd. What I'm focused on here is what would happen if, when the gates are down and the train is occupying 32nd with a 27th Street grade separation, and how much extra time might it take? So we looked at this from a perspective that either Addy or Main Street could be used to relieve folks who are backing up behind a train. We cut down to 27th, cross over BNSF on the new grade separation, and then come back to the east and connect back to 32nd at Evergreen. In the inbound direction, our travel time increase was a small, remarkably small, just 20 seconds. And that's because the series of right turns basically don't add that much time and keep traffic moving. This versus, say, a 4-minute closure for a train.
What about traffic signals through those loops? Are you going to cover that?
Yes. In terms of assumptions and so forth, we assumed both of the new realigned the intersection at Main Street and new intersection at 27th and E Street would be signalized. We also looked at 27th and Addy, and it needs to either be signalized or a roundabout. A roundabout at 27th and Addy performed significantly better for us, so that would likely be where we would recommend.
It's hard to believe with traffic lights you would only add 22nd.
Because of the right turn, because it's right turns and basically all the way around, you're getting the advantage of being able to take rights on red. With the left turns, when they get involved, and we could advance to the next slide, in the outbound direction, you're basically fighting left turns. The route around adds about 3 minutes of time, so that's basically fighting the left turn movements, and everybody wanting to make that route around a train. I will note that the 3 minutes is still less than the amount of time that a train is likely to occupy the grade crossing. So if you arrived at 32nd and Evergreen and the gates were just dropping for a train, it would still be faster to use the 27th and loop around.
And do you take into effect how many cars might be deviating because the train is there?
Yes, we looked at it from a very high level. It's a fairly basic traffic analysis that we were able to conduct. There's the opportunity to go in more depth and simulate in greater detail what the train might be doing and how cars will deviate. But we basically assumed anybody who was waiting, saw the train, they would divert. So we programmed it as 100% diversion. That may or may not be reality, but it gives us kind of a worst case scenario. So we don't expect it to be any worse than 3 minutes, although 3 minutes at times a bit of out of direction travel.
Do those times include the wait times at 32nd and Evergreen traffic light?
Yes.
Okay, the left turns there also?
Yes.
Inbound?
Yeah. The left
And then
turns there.
the other question is, if we build at 27th, can Burlington Northern require we close 32nd?
That is something that we haven't had, or I haven't had an opportunity to fully vet, and I know it was one of the questions. We do know, or we have experienced with other rail projects we've been involved with a where you add a crossing, grade separated or otherwise, you need to remove a crossing. What we couldn't immediately come up with information on is whether or not you're directed to on which crossing you close, or whether you can select which one to eliminate.
I can say that in our conversations a couple months ago or so on site with essentially the equivalent of a public works director for BNSF in the region, we pointed to 24th. if you want funding from the BNSF, you have to close another crossing. And that's the way the CFR is set up, that the Federal Railroad Administration administers those rules. There's no funding, or BNSF is not required to fund a crossing if there isn't an exchange of a closure. In that conversation, their head turned to 32nd, and their head turned in the other direction, and we talked about 24th, and I didn't sense from them any pushback that, oh no, it will be 32nd if you want any money. This topic could come up in funding conversations, potentially if we seek out surface transportation program, STP money. STP money is carrying the lion's share of the intersection project. It's not clear that it is required, but some conversation about that, and so I think it's fair to say the question could come up. Whether we would be required to do it in order to get funding is an unknown. I don't believe so from BNSF. However, BNSF's money is not of a scope that makes or breaks.
5% of only a portion of it, right?
It's 5%. What they're required to do is 5% of the cost of a theoretical crossing. It doesn't include sidewalks. It doesn't include landscaping. It replaces like with like, so if the approaching street, like 27th, is a 2-lane facility, they will pay 5% of what it would cost to build a 2-lane facility. The way that this, and I can't remember his title.
Only that comes through their easement.
And only the part, right? So what they kind of do is, he used this visual for me as we were standing out there talking. He said, imagine you're just out in the middle of the desert on flat ground, and there's point A and point B, and it's a 2-lane road on either side, and you're going to build a bridge over the top of that. We'll give you 5% of that. That will not be 5% of the $16, $17 million. It'll be 5% of a much smaller number, and we don't know what that would be yet until we go through that exercise. All of that to say, that leverage isn't as, I mean, we'll take several $100,000 if that's what it ends up being. Certainly we would take it, but that leverage in the project, financial leverage, isn't as critical as potentially, say, STP money from the federal government passing through the state, and what criteria they might have and how they might consider a 24th versus a 32nd closure. So we can't tell you today, nope, never have to close 32nd, or yes, you will have to close it.
Okay. So that kind of takes me through kind of the analysis and the information that came together as a result of our work in 2011, and into some of what we've been looking at the past month or so. And one of the things we wanted to do was provide better information on a 27th Street overcrossing. What might it look like? Where could it go? How feasible is it? And could it actually happen? So the first thing I wanted to mention, and you can look at the image on the lower left side, we've got options in terms of how we connect into E Street. We focused on kind of the straightest route because that is actually the most challenging for us to make a connection with. If we can make that work, we can make the others work. But we really have choices in terms of how we sweep 27th from Main Street over and connect into E Street. And you can really connect anywhere from 26th all the way over to 28th, and maybe even a little east of 28th if you elected to. The kind of the sweep to the east represents what we were showing with that early 1983 WSDOT concept. The longer we can make the distance between Main Street and the railroad, so the longer the street is on 27th, Between that and the high point where we need to cross the railroad tracks, the less we have to move Main Street south. And again, what we're going to be showing today and what we're showing for the Main Street is what we think is the worst case scenario for that
And on that point,
realignment.
Chris, just briefly, Chris mentioned, he's showing these three options. There are, really, it's almost infinite options in between there, and even a little bit further to the east. You can see on the right-hand image, you can see where the spur line goes. You can kind of see some property lines that make that curve. If you swept parallel to that, you get a lot more length, and potentially that could really reduce how far south you have to take off in order to get over the top. However, once you do that and you start to move a little bit further east on East Street, and then Chris will tell you, well, that introduces, okay, how close are we to 32nd? How do we tie in there? And it involves more right-of-way. That adds some cost. So each of these options has different trade-offs. There's nothing set in stone at this point. This shows what three of those options might look like, and this, as he said, is the worst-case scenario. And it requires some realignment of Main Street, and it impacts property.
Yeah.
Are you going to cover the impact of the property tonight?
Yes, briefly. Because the options vary, while in terms of realignment of the public streets within the option that we have shown here, the primary option is kind of the worst case. It's also the straightest route, so it's going to have the least amount of property impact, particularly with respect to developed property. So displacements of residents or businesses. I believe all added up, I was looking at approximately 8 parcels being impacted. The two larger ones, the dog park and then the larger vacant lot to the west side, and then a handful of residential properties. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to bring up on while I had this slide up is kind of what does East Street look like, or what might it need beyond traffic signals. And so I did look into how much left turn storage would be needed on East Street, and determined that it's about 100 feet for 27th, which is less than or approximately less than a block length. And it's about 250 to 300 feet approaching 32nd and Evergreen, which would need to lengthen out the left turn storage there. Still not even as far back as where East Street and Evergreen do their split, and it sweeps onto and becomes Evergreen. So what does this look like, in profile or elevation view? We've really, took a look at this from a feasibility standpoint. Where do our touchdowns? How much fill do we have? How much bridge would we be building? One of the more interesting things you can see here is that the 27th Street alignment takes advantage of the fact that East Street and the property north of the railroad tracks sit up on a berm, basically, or there's a grade raise of about 8 to 10 feet, and so we don't have as far to climb on the north side to get up and over the tracks as we do on the south, and it's why we can actually make the connection at East Street without having to worry about raising East Street or making any changes to it at all. I will note that grades are fairly steep. not insurmountable, very similar to actually Washougal River Road, if not, and if I can trust Google, wasn't able to get as-built, so I don't know if we were able to pull them up, but if I can trust Google, it might even be a little bit flatter than the approaches that you have today at the Washougal River Road grade separation.
We were told that the Washougal River Road grade separation was not up to today's code, that it's too steep.
It's steep, yes, and from a pedestrian access point of view, it exceeds the desirable, and in fact, this does as well, but just slightly. There are ways we can address that specific concern with engineering, usually by offering a switchback pathway for wheelchair or accessible needs. For this, it's not a fatal flaw, for lack of a better phrase. It's something that could be accommodated. The bridge itself is flatter than that, so is and can accommodate pedestrian needs. The other thing you might note is that we're showing a 3-span bridge, and I just wanted to highlight this. This is different than what we were even conceptualizing back in 2011. I had our bridge engineers take a look at the overall bridge concept, and the tall retaining walls at a certain point become just as expensive, if not more so, than an extra span on a bridge. And so from a largely cost neutral and slightly and more aesthetic bridge crossing design, he was recommending going ahead and adding an extra span on each end.
If the Burlington Northern decides to double track, would there be room on this bridge for that?
Yes. We took that into consideration, as well as standard railroad clearances to the bridge piers. So they'd be okay for that, and we've got adequate vertical clearance to accommodate it as well.
And before you leave that, what's interesting to note, if you look toward the left, you see the center line of the realigned Main Street is the farthest to the left. That's where you start to take off to get your ramp. You need to be 10 feet above grade at the center line of the existing Main Street, and this is why you have to move Main Street south.
Correct. And the reason is we've got the railroad spur running down into the port, which we still have to have a at-grade crossing of Main Street with that railroad spur. Without that spur there, we'd have more options and more choices with regards to Main Street, but the spur itself basically ties our hands and dictates, how far we have to move Main Street.
That's my exact question. I'm looking at Google Maps, but it's not showing the spur. At least this doesn't work well. Where is that in comparison to where we're looking
come
right
back
now?
one exhibit. So the railroad spur is this arcing line right here, and then it parallels 27th Street all the way down underneath SR 14 and out to Index. In fact, I think you cross it again when you get onto Index. So when we were looking at this, sweeping away, but we can't change the grade of the railroad spur. We can't make it go up and down and so forth. So we really have to match Main Street to the point on 27th where 27th and the railroad track are at the same level. And that's where Main Street comes across. We really have little latitude beyond that as our choice for an intersection.
If we can, Council, from here on out, if you could hold questions, make sure and write them down. I know Chris has still got another 11 pages or so to go, and we certainly want to get into those alternatives that you brought up in regards to 39th Street and Sunset View Road. So We've got a bit to cover yet.
Okay, so I just zoomed in, that had a slide here that zoomed in on Main Street just to get a closer look at it. This is a full, kind of meets all of city code requirements for street design without any variances. There's certainly things that can be explored through engineering to tighten things up. What I did want to note, though, is that we did take into consideration truck movements coming on, what we hope will be infrequent on Main Street, because it is more of a residential street, but for trucks that we're using Main Street, they can make the turns, although careful consideration will be needed primarily on the southeast corner of the intersection, because there'll be crossing gate equipment on that corner that would need to be accommodated and might pinch off turns from the largest of trucks. So we took a similar run at 32nd, trying to take it up to a similar level of analysis. With our 2011 study, we really looked at, well, what does 32nd look like from a basic profile? We didn't think about too deeply as to what might happen with Evergreen. We basically said, oh, let's just raise Evergreen up. And what happens? Well, now you got walls kind of going all ways, and you're rebuilding a quarter mile of Evergreen up on walls. Everybody loses their access and so forth, and it kind of was like, oh, this isn't good. This isn't going to work for us. Subsequently, there have been several, or at least one other concept that I've seen passed along that looked at a more thorough realignment of Evergreen up through, kind of to align it with E Street and run it up through the commercial shopping center. That would carry with it some pretty substantial costs in right-of-way impacts and commercial displacements and so forth. It's still an option, although not one that I'm fully supportive of from my own engineering background, but that's personal opinion on my part. But I wanted to take another run at this to see if we had a better idea. And so my design engineer and I, we worked out this idea of what I'm going to call a jug handle, for lack of a better kind of terminology. But it's basically connecting at E Street and sweeping back to tee into Evergreen in a way that can accommodate left turns. And that proved to be feasible, with the caveat that we're largely looking at buying the property in that triangle kind of created between Evergreen, E Street, and 32nd. We also looked at this from a perspective of what happens to traffic under all these conditions. We're now creating a new intersection on Evergreen. Traffic needs to make the left turn and drop down there. It's a fundamental change to how traffic is flowing. We're setting up a series of turns, left turns, right turns, and so forth for people to navigate the area. And we're also fundamentally changing the way the neighborhood to the south and east of the overcrossing east of 32nd would access their neighborhood, as well as access to the shopping center, which would move up to F Street or F Place. That might be F Place, but basically coming in through what is their freight access, that would almost become the primary access to the shopping center off of 32nd. Certainly wasn't set up for that much traffic and routes of, all that shopping center traffic in front of all the houses on that street. For the neighborhood to the south, we're looking at, I'm going to say a closure of A Street where it connects to 32nd. That would be cul-de-sac. as the kind of the least impactful solutions to dealing with a difference in grade. And Main Street could be cul-de-sac, or, as I'll show now, could, with some minor realignment and maybe a little bit of lowering, could dip under an extra span on the bridge or on the overcrossing itself. So that's why we're showing a kind of a fourth span on this option. But again, we're looking at Main Street, a roadway level that's 17 feet, or, well, that's 17 to the bottom of the bridge, so like 22 feet in the air over the intersection that's out there now to get up and over the railroad tracks. At A Street, we're 5 to 6 feet above where it is right now. So as tall as I am in terms of moving the street up, which is why we're thinking cul-de-sacing rather than trying to rebuild that street and chase it halfway up the block, and who knows what happens to folks' driveways and so forth.
Oh, I thought you were going to leave the slide.
Oh, I was just looking. The other thing that I wanted to point out on this particular slide is that the crossing over the railroad dictates kind of everything else. It's still our controlling parameter. So it's by circumstance or coincidence that as we come across the existing Evergreen intersection, we're 25 feet up in the air, and we actually have enough room to easily bridge up and over the top of Evergreen with little problems.
Being that Evergreen could pass underneath.
Evergreen
exactly the way it is
can
now.
pass underneath the way it is now, which is what supports that jug handle concept, and why it looked like a less impactful, lower cost, although I'm not going to say inexpensive, but a lower cost way to perhaps pursue reconnecting up all of the road network.
That's the challenge, that if your grade separating not only the railroad tracks in 32nd, your grade separating Main in 32nd, and your grade separating Evergreen in 32nd. Sure, Evergreen can go through, but they're not connected. How do you make that connection? And as you can see here, this project is very long compared to, we start at Addy, and we start going up, and we don't land until we get to F. So that's why all the access points into the commercial development, both sides of 32nd, go away. At the center line of E Street, which I think is roughly where the driveway is between Jack in the Box and the building that has Subway in it, that's 6 feet above the ground. So potentially, I guess you could come up with a ramp on the private property and build retaining walls in front of those buildings and cut things off and ramp yourself down in there. Otherwise, you lose that. You've lost that access. Now all of a sudden the access is on F, and folks coming down 32nd, if we go back to the slide just prior, yeah, you're coming south on 32nd from all of the neighborhoods up the hill, and you want to get into the shopping center. If you stay on 32nd, you can't get there. If you stay on it to cross, you can't get there. So you're going to, I guess, make a left at F there, which it's not designed for, or use this jug handle, sneak off at 32nd on that little spur there that Chris was talking about, and then try to work your way on Evergreen back underneath and come up in off of Evergreen, where a lot of folks go in right now. If you are coming up off of the freeway and you need to get there, you can't get there because you're way up in the air. You can't get to Evergreen. You'd come up and make your right on F, or you'd try to loop around on that jug handle thing there. That same conversation would apply to businesses if we didn't have to move those businesses as part of this project on the west side as well. Very impactful. Is this a good time to talk about the constructability question and impacts of the constructability?
Yeah, I was going to hit it on the next slide, but why don't we talk about it here because it does have the visual. The other thing that we should be thinking of in terms of, let's build 32nd on 32nd itself, is the duration of time it takes to build a project like this. A project that goes up and over the top of the railroad, as we're showing here, is likely 9 to 12 months worth of construction. If we went underneath the railroad track and instead elected to build a bridge for the railroad and then duck under, despite some other technical challenges that may be involved there, because of the back and forth of work that BNSF would need to do in terms of temporary track realignments and so forth, you're probably looking at a 2-year construction window, during which time, short of acquiring property to temporarily realign 32nd, 32nd is closed. And that's something to consider and keep in mind. All right, to touch briefly on costs, I don't want to belabor this too much because we did touch on it a little earlier. We did some estimating back in 2011. There's been some more recent work that basically supports anything that we did, so I'm behind it. We're looking at a 27th Street bridge that's on the order of magnitude of $17 million. That's kind of all inclusive of everything, engineering and administration, as well as the construction. The 32nd project looks anywhere from $32 million, which is probably similar to the concept that I was showing here tonight, upwards of $50 million, which would be kind of the realign Evergreen, buy all this commercial property and then just set it up for, in some ways, for redevelopment. Or if we looked at trying to realign or duck underneath the railroad tracks, that's likely to incur costs. As a comparative project, City of Vancouver just underwent grade separation with the BNSF in their downtown. They built railroad bridge.
Esther Street?
At Esther Street, or near Esther Short Park, 8th and Grant and so forth. That project was all told about $45 million. So that kind of gives you a context of a project of similar scale. We are looking at about 8 displacements with 27th. Best case I could count at 32nd was 11, mostly commercial. Other options could fluctuate that number greatly. Just want to make sure I had things here, and in the interest of time, kind of move us along. I guess the last thing I wanted to point out on this is just to keep in mind that the railroad traffic projected for 2030, they're projecting about 55 trains per day still on the railroad tracks, which would account for the at-grade crossing being blocked about 20% of the day.
According to Burlington Northern right now, we'll hit that next month.
Yeah, well, there we go. So yeah, 12 to 15 minutes out of the hour, gates would be down. There's not a lot to say about the 32nd Street interchange concept. This came from our previous study, other than that we did take a look at it. It looked not impossible. I mean, anything is feasible. We were concerned about property impacts. We were concerned about some visual and noise impacts to the neighborhood to the east, as well as costs associated with this, because it looked like we might have to. We were thinking it might be a bridge SR14 up and over the top of 32nd. You might be able to flip that, but any interchange like this, your starting price is about $30 million, and then goes up as you meet challenges.
And real quick on that, the reason we're showing that is if you're going to do the crossing, if we're going to do the crossing at 32nd, it kind of points to the fact that you would want access to the state route at 32nd versus if you're doing 27th, you look at 27th. If WashDOT would let us do that, and again, that's assuming there's an interchange at River. If there's not an interchange at River, then this would be feasible. It's more expensive than at 27th because you have to build the separation. The separation exists at 27th already. So in all of this, you're trying to leverage right-of-way you already have, and you're trying to leverage infrastructure that you already have to keep the costs down. Older versions of concepts on the state route that have roundabouts on the state route, just to throw that out there, looked at 32nd. That could connect to this project, which is more impactful and more expensive, but feasible on 32nd. Similarly at 27th, or at 20, I think it was at about 24th, I saw a version where you were on the freeway, on the state route, you're at 24th, there's a roundabout, and it kind of gets you over onto 27th. It was an interesting concept. So all of that to say, if we cross at 27th, it doesn't lock in what happens on the state route, but 27th would become the focal point for where you would make that connection. How you would make it could still be designed. If you cross at 32nd, it doesn't preclude or foreclose all the options. However, it does make 32nd the focal point for how you would access it. That just kind of follows.
Yeah. Okay. So we did also want to touch on 39th Street, and David and I will tag team this a little bit. I did some initial very, very high level layout on this, just basically taking a look at what these grade separations might look like at the and we looked at, in this case, at 39th Street following the power line route southward. There's not a 39th Street that connects through now. So it would, to a great degree, bisect the residential neighborhood that's already there, and probably require some displacement of the residents, if not just taking a good chunk out of their backyards. And with associated noise impacts of building a new arterial through a residential subdivision. From the perspective of looking back to what our goals were in 2011, it really provides limited benefit to the Port of Camas-Washougal. The proximity of Evergreen to the BNSF tracks, in a similar way to 32nd, makes grade separating a challenge. We basically need to chase Evergreen, but we don't have like that jug handle concept. We really don't have that kind of same opportunity at this location. So we do have to. I think in this case, I was thinking we might lower Evergreen and duck it underneath the tracks, because the tracks sit up a little higher relative to Evergreen. And finally, I just wanted to point out that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service owns all of the land south of SR 14, and that's designated wildlife refuge as part of the Stigwald Wildlife Preserve, as well as wetland. And so a through street connecting back towards the port across that federally protected land is questionable in terms of its feasibility.
Should say there is a strip of private property that's not government owned just immediately south of the state route there. The crosshatched ground is the key that you used for the Fish and Wildlife.
Yes, yeah, that's what came in from their website information for their refuge boundary.
So you'd be working with private property in terms of ramps or whatever you'd be doing there, but any connectivity back into the port, unless it was going to be made through frontage road somehow to 32nd, I suppose could be done. If it was going to go south and sneak over into Steigerwald somehow, it'd be very challenging to do that. And I just don't know, we haven't asked WSDOT about this concept. I just don't know what WSDOT would think about this in terms of them investing in their facility there at that location for an interchange of some kind. And then I think the part that I was going to look at, and we found out that the pointer doesn't work on the screen. It goes away. So it works over here, though. And I'll do the best I can to find 39th. I think it's right here. So we talked about the goal of getting access to the port. We'd have to cut through that potentially unless we could somehow wrap back like that. All the displacements here, a lot to work out there. If there is still the goal of the northeast urban growth area, if that's still on the table, and then the purpose of the crossing is to facilitate access to that, you're either going to have to find your way back over here and we build that corridor to get into this area, or you need to figure out some other way to do that. So you'd be bringing, we're talking into the future now. We're planning 20 plus years. Freight potentially moving up here. This is the corridor where we have right of way. These roads are not designed for that per se, so we'd be looking at changes there. We might need to bring, potentially you could come through here. It goes by the high, up past the golf course, by the high school, and then back over and come up. You could go up closer to our summit. There's some different ways to do that, and you can get yourself back over to 32nd, but it introduces challenges and it brings you through areas of town that really weren't designed for that. This still needs to be improved, but it's a main arterial and is a preferred
So could you
approach.
outline how this works with 27th, though? How that would all work with 27th?
We could go back quite a few slides, and there's that slide that shows the movements, but I could do it on here too.
Just wait for this one.
That's your outbound, but yeah.
Inbound?
Yeah, so do the best I can. 27th, there's your crossing. When the state route is completed, we can make an assumption that we're here with a vehicle. Now, there's an interim, and I'll talk about that. You go up, you go over, you come down, and you make a left and go up. And that's the timing that they modeled.
That doesn't strike me as ideal.
No, notwithstanding all the other impacts, it would be more ideal to go straight up.
Right.
That's 39.
That's 32nd.
That's
Right.
32nd.
But that's at least twice as expensive and dramatically impacts existing commercial development to either side of it. But it's feasible. It could be done. This is an analysis to look at what the implications are. So it doesn't mean you can't do it. You can do it. It also has all of those implications and impacts that Chris was describing to the neighborhood there. Cuts off the access on the west side of that neighborhood here.
Is there anything that could be done to avoid Evergreen and just have it cut through directly and directly connect with 32nd, or would that just be too much?
From 39th?
From 27th?
I think it's kind of shown on that sketch that Chris had up early, the WSDOT sketch, but there's significant residential impacts to snake that road up in a more direct route to 32nd Street.
Oh, you mean to
The very first sketch, yeah.
Yeah,
come up here
yeah.
and go
I'm
way
just
back.
trying to see if I've
Yeah.
got some,
I
a
mean,
little bit more
it just
ground here.
strikes
Maybe
me.
on there, too.
Maybe it's the least bad of all the options. Maybe that's what we're talking about here,
That's
right?
right. Yeah, I mean, these are the options. Some of the table has been set. That development exists, the other development exists. Evergreen goes like that. E stays up here, crazy angles for the intersection. The grades and the elevations at 32nd, development that exists there, the grades and elevations at 27th, those are all the input parameters that the engineers have to use in order to do the options analysis. If we had a whiteboard and could start over, it's not how we would line it up at all.
Okay.
I'd like to hear from Parsons Briggeroff.
On.
We got one more to show him. He does have one more to show.
Okay. All right. All right. And the final thing we wanted to, or concept we wanted to throw out was also the idea of looking at sunset view. Basically, on a 39th Street, what I said about 39th Street applies here as well. We'd be bounding Gibbons Creek on one side. I thought about, well, the track still sits up high, maybe we can lower it, but we'd have to be mindful of what the creek is actually doing. Bounds a mobile home park in this case, so there may be some concerns about that. And again, we're also Sunset View is the boundary to the Gorge Scenic Area. East of Sunset View is the Gorge area, and then we've got the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge overlay all over the place out here as well. Again, also south of SR 14, kind of blocking our access southward. In terms of kind of how this relates to the bigger picture and connection points, Dave, you can probably speak to this again, but this is one I filled in a little bit more on. This looks at trying to get, how would this connect or how would this benefit the overall street network? While not really serving the port, it does serve the planned employment center zoning up, north of W Street, and you would likely see some sort of connector road under this option that would almost have to be built at this point if we locate an interchange and grade separation here, connecting Sunset View up to W and that employment center.
Right. The only comments I would add are wherever that would take off, we don't have any right-of-way there. It's outside of the UGA potentially with the boundary there. Environmental impacts here. Not sure if you could even go straight there because of the topography, so we may be looking at some sort of a switchback road. And then similarly, there's some topography here and difficult to get over to this corridor. So as we looked at this option, and we talked about a number of things, Chris and the team on this one, we have not costed out right-of-way acquisition or what the corridor would be, but you can just imagine this would be very, very, very expensive because we don't have any of that right-of-way at all right now. And if you went back just two more really quick, could you talk, Chris, about even where you have the red lines that show?
This one?
One of the challenges here is how does the 39th, the new 39th that was elevated across the tracks, how would you get from that to Evergreen if you could at all? And we decided not to show it, but you were verbalizing loops and ramps and
In this case, I actually the red line you see running east and west onto Evergreen is about 500 feet of 400 or 500 feet of length in terms of what you're seeing there. That's about what I calculated it would take in terms of street, either raising it or lowering it to bring it up and meet a crossing with the BNSF. similarly kind of running up 39th to complete that connection. So you can imagine with dramatic grade changes, let's say the Evergreen intersection out there being lowered, let's call it 20 feet. What that means in terms of the access to all of those existing homes that abut 39th, face 39th, and then face Evergreen out there. It would be, in some cases, probably insurmountable changes to their access that would dictate some acquisitions and displacements. Not that some of that land couldn't be repurposed for storm drainage and that kind of thing, but in general, it's something we hope to avoid on projects like this.
And when we chatted, Chris, even though you didn't cost this out, the scope of work that we were affording with this particular iteration didn't accommodate that. I recall your comment to us as a team was at this level of analysis, you wouldn't recommend to us having you do any further work on this one or the other one because
Conceptually, this one looks like, to me, and if I had to ballpark it, it looked like combining a couple things. I mean, it looked like a $60 million project to do what's the red line work on here, just ballparking with all the right-of-way and so forth. In an interchange, 2 bridges, so forth. That's what it was looking like to me. Basically, a $30 million interchange, and then a new arterial street, and then another grade separating, basically a 27th Street. So you're looking at 20 million and 40 million. it adds up pretty quick. So this looked like, and the other one, and Sunset Views similarly, they look like $60 million projects, just ballpark. I mean,
And that would just be at
back
the
of the
state route
envelope.
for Sunset.
Yeah.
Then you have to add in whatever it would take to.
Yeah, that ignores the connection up across the ravine and so forth, which might be structure and bridges in and of itself, which looks also pretty expensive, just the way it's been described.
David?
Move to recess the meeting until 7 o'clock.
Yeah, actually, we won't recess it. I'll be adjourning this meeting. And what I'll do is go ahead and bring on continuation of this, sorry, Chris, during the regular council meeting, plus the administrative update as well.
Mine's very quick.
Onto the back portion of that. For those of you in the audience, just so you know, we've got a city council meeting scheduled for 7 o'clock. The agenda for that is extremely short, at least on paper. It appears that it's extremely short. So hopefully we'll get to the remainder of this discussion and then questions and comments, that type of stuff as part of that as well. Okay. And then we've also got a transportation benefit district meeting scheduled right on the heels of that city council meeting after its adjournment. So
Do you want to stay in this format for all of that?
totally up to council.
Do you want to stay in this format for all of that instead of tearing it down and setting up?
Sure.
Since it's going to be like some workshops still?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Okay,
Okay.
so we'll leave the room as is.
It'll- yeah,
Yeah, time. Effort.